June 1942. The skies over Britain buzzed with RAF bombers preparing for another night assault over occupied Europe. For 2 years, the Royal Air Force had carried the burden of the strategic bombing campaign, pounding German cities under the cover of darkness. The cost had been immense, but Britain had little choice. Daylight raids were too dangerous without adequate fighter escort. Into this scene of exhaustion and desperation arrived a new force, the United States 8th Air Force. They would soon be called the Mighty 8th, but in those first weeks their future was anything but certain. The 8th Air Force was officially activated on January 28, 1942, in Savannah, Georgia, only weeks after Pearl Harbor catapulted America into the war. Its mission was bold, almost audacious, to wage a daylight strategic bombing offensive against Nazi Germany from bases in England. American commanders believed in the doctrine of precision bombing, striking enemy industry, oil plants, and transport hubs with such accuracy that the German war machine would grind to a halt. Unlike Britain's nighttime area bombing strategy, the U.S. approach relied on daylight visibility, advanced bomb sites, and heavily armed bombers like the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and consolidated B-24 Liberator. But turning theory into reality required logistics on a massive scale. By the summer of 1942, convoys of ships were carrying thousands of American airmen, mechanics, and supplies across U-boat infested waters to Britain. Airfields in East Anglia, flat farmland east of Cambridge, were rapidly transformed into sprawling bases with long concrete runways, vast hangars, and barracks large enough to house entire bomb groups. Towns like Bassingbourn, Thorpe Abbotts, and Alconbury suddenly found themselves neighbors to American flyers in leather jackets and baseball caps, bringing with them jazz records, Lucky Strike cigarettes, and the promise of help in Britain's darkest hour. The first combat mission of the 8th Air Force took place on August 17, 1942, when a dozen B-17s of the 97th Bomb Group flew from RAF Polebrook against a railroad marshalling yard in Rouen, France. The mission was led by Colonel Frank Armstrong and Brigadier General Ira Eaker, both determined to prove the American doctrine could work. To the relief of many, the raid was a success. No planes were lost. Bombs struck their targets, and the message was clear. The United States was in the fight. Yet optimism masked the scale of the challenge. In 1942, the Luftwaffe was still one of the most formidable air forces in the world. German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf FW 190 patrolled the skies over France, supported by dense flak defenses around key targets. American bombers could defend themselves with heavy machine guns mounted in nose, tail, and side turrets. But once they penetrated deep into Europe without escort fighters, they were vulnerable to concentrated German attacks. The Flying Fortress was tough, but no machine could survive endless waves of fighters. Morale among early American crews was a mixture of confidence and dread. Pilots and gunners believed in the strength of their aircraft and the righteousness of their mission, but every man knew the odds. A bomber group might launch with 20 planes and return with only half. Survivors often spoke of the eerie silence in the debriefing rooms, empty chairs marking the absence of friends. Still, the 8th pressed on. Each mission tested not just the courage of the crews, but the viability of daylight bombing itself. British observers were skeptical. RAF commanders, having learned the hard way in 1939 and 1940, doubted that unescorted daylight bombing could succeed. They preferred night raids, where darkness provided some protection. General Eaker and his American staff insisted otherwise. They argued that the Norden bomb site, combined with tight bomber formations, would allow precision strikes that could cripple German war production. "We'll prove it in the skies," Eaker told his British counterparts. The debate was more than academic. It was about how to fight the air war that would decide Europe's fate. By the end of 1942, the 8th Air Force had established a foothold in Britain. Its numbers were still small, only a few dozen operational bombers, far short of the 1,000 plane raids envisioned by planners in Washington. Losses were mounting, and each mission revealed the brutal reality of going head-to-head with the Luftwaffe. But the Americans were not deterred. Instead, they dug in, building airfields at breakneck speed, training replacement crews, and flying mission after mission to gain experience. The nickname, the Mighty Eighth, began circulating in the press, more hopeful than factual at first. But it captured the spirit of what this force was meant to become, a hammer that could break the Luftwaffe, shatter German industry, and pave the way for Allied invasion. The year 1942 closed with more questions than answers. Could daylight bombing really succeed? Could the Eighth survive the storm that awaited them over occupied Europe? What no one doubted was their resolve. American crews painted nose art on their bombers, carried Lucky Charms in their pockets, and climbed aboard aircraft with names like Memphis Belle and Hell's Angels. They were young, many barely in their 20s, but they carried the weight of strategy on their shoulders. Britain had endured the Blitz, but the road to victory required more than endurance. It required taking the fight into the heart of Germany. And that was the mission of the Mighty Eighth. From the moment the 8th Air Force landed in England, its commanders faced a fundamental question. How should the United States fight the air war over Europe? The British Royal Air Force had already answered it in their own way. After the disastrous daylight raids of 1939-40, in which RAF bombers were slaughtered by German fighters and flak, the British switched almost entirely to night bombing. Under Air Marshal Arthur Harris' Bomber Command, adopted the doctrine of area bombing, large formations of bombers dropping explosives over German cities under cover of darkness. Accuracy was poor, but survival rates were higher, and the strategy promised to break German morale by destroying entire urban centers. The Americans saw things differently. U.S. Doctrine shaped in the interwar years by men like General Billy Mitchell and the Air Corps Tactical School insisted that precision daylight bombing could cripple an enemy's war-making capacity. With advanced technology like the Norden bombsight, capable, at least in theory, of dropping a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet, American strategists believed they could destroy oil refineries, ball bearing plants, and aircraft factories without the need to raise entire cities. The vision was clean, surgical, and uniquely American. War fought with accuracy and efficiency. General Ira Eaker, who led the 8th in its early days, was determined to prove this doctrine correct. We will attack the German military machine with precision by day and destroy its vital centers of production. He declared, to him, bombing cities indiscriminately was both ineffective and morally troubling. But to carry out daylight bombing, the Americans had to accept the greatest risk of all, exposure to the Luftwaffe. The RAF was skeptical, even dismissive. British commanders told the Americans that daylight raids were suicide, pointing to their own bitter experience in 1939 and 1940. "You'll be shot out of the sky," Harris warned, but the Americans were not easily swayed. They pointed to the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator, 4 engine bombers bristling with up to 13.50 caliber machine guns. Flown in tight defensive combat boxer formations, the bombers could, in theory, lay down enough overlapping fire to protect one another from German fighters. This self-defending bomber concept became central to the daylight bombing gamble. Early raids seemed to support the American view. Precision strikes against targets in France and the Low Countries often succeeded with few losses. Crews came home jubilant, convinced their doctrine was sound. Headlines in American newspapers praised the courage and accuracy of the Yanks over Europe. Morale soared, and the confidence of the American public grew. But these early raids were short hops across the Channel, close to friendly territory, with limited Luftwaffe opposition. The true test would come when the 8th went deep into Germany itself, beyond the reach of Allied fighters. By late 1942 and early 1943, daylight bombing had become more than a tactic. It was a political statement. Washington wanted proof that American air power could deliver a knockout blow to Germany. Roosevelt and Churchill had agreed at the Casablanca Conference to mount a combined bomber offensive. The British would bomb by night, the Americans by day, creating a round-the-clock assault designed to overwhelm German defenses. "The enemy shall have no rest, day or night," the plan declared. For the 8th Air Force, that meant flying daylight missions into the teeth of the Luftwaffe. The gamble carried a moral weight as well. To American commanders, precision bombing represented a way to wage war that spared civilian lives, at least compared to area bombing. But reality soon challenged this ideal. Weather, flak, and fighter attacks often disrupted formations, scattering bombs across unintended targets. Accuracy from 20,000 feet was far less than the pickle barrel promise of the Norden bomb site. Inevitably, civilians died, and the line between precision and area bombing blurred. Still, the Americans clung to their vision, because abandoning it meant admitting defeat. For the crews, daylight bombing was both a badge of pride and a source of terror. Flying in broad daylight meant they could see everything. The flak bursts, the fighters swarming in, the bomb doors opening. It also meant they could see other bombers exploding beside them, or tumbling earthward in flames. Night bombing spared crews the full view of destruction. Daylight offered no such mercy. The British public, meanwhile, watched with mixed feelings. On one hand, the arrival of the mighty 8th symbolized American resolve. On the other, many Britons shook their heads, convinced the Yanks were throwing away lives on a doomed experiment. Still, the presence of thousands of Americans, living in local villages, filling pubs and courting local girls, fostered camaraderie. As the saying went, the Americans were overpaid, oversexed, and overhere, but they were also welcome allies in the fight. By mid-1943, daylight bombing was no longer just a gamble. It was the defining feature of the American war in Europe. The strategy promised glory but risked disaster. Every mission was a roll of the dice, and the stakes were nothing less than air supremacy. The coming months would reveal just how high the price of daylight bombing could be. The raids over places like Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Bremen would test the concept to its breaking point. Could bombers really defend themselves without long-range escort fighters? Could the 8th Air Force sustain the losses and still strike decisive blows against German industry? The answers would soon come, written in the smoke trails of crippled bombers and the casualty lists of America's finest young airmen. The year 1943 dawned with cautious optimism for the 8th Air Force. They had survived their first missions, proved their bombers could strike in daylight, and earned the respect of their British allies. But as their raids pushed deeper into German territory, optimism gave way to brutal reality. The Luftwaffe was far from beaten, and the 8th Air Force was about to face its bloodiest test. In the spring of 1943, American bombers struck industrial centers in the Ruhr Valley, Germany's arsenal of the Reich. It was a dense web of steel plants, coal mines, and chemical works, heavily defended by flak batteries and swarms of fighters. B-17s flying in tight box formations unleashed their payloads on Essen, Dortmund, and Bremen, but the cost was staggering. For every raid, dozens of bombers failed to return. Survivors often limped home with holes punched through their fuselages, engines smoking, and crews bloodied. The lesson was clear. The deeper into Germany they went, the deadlier it became. Then came August 17, 1943. A date burned into the memory of every airman. On that day, the 8th Air Force launched a daring twin strike known as the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. The plan was ambitious. One bomber force would hit the Messerschmitt aircraft factories at Regensburg, while another would destroy ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt, crippling Germany's ability to build fighters and machinery. Ball bearings were the lifeblood of modern war. and Allied planners believed a successful attack could paralyze the Nazi war machine. The execution, however, exposed the limits of the daylight strategy. Without long-range fighter escorts, the bombers were on their own once they crossed into Germany. The Luftwaffe pounced with brutal efficiency. Waves of Bf-109s and FW-190s tore into the formations, firing cannons and machine guns, diving through flak bursts to press their attacks. Bomber gunners fought back fiercely, and some Luftwaffe fighters fell in flames, but the Germans held the advantage. The Regensburg force, after dropping its bombs, continued south to North Africa as planned, unable to return to England. The Schweinfurt force, meanwhile, endured hours of relentless combat as it fought its way back across Europe. By the time the mission ended, 60 bombers, nearly 1 in 5, were lost, and hundreds of American airmen were dead, captured, or missing. The ball-bearing factories were damaged, but production quickly recovered. It was a bitter reality. The cost outweighed the results. Crews called it Black Thursday, and the impact on morale was devastating. Men stared at empty bunks in the barracks, chairs left vacant in the mess halls, and rows of crosses filling the cemeteries of East Anglia. Those who survived knew their odds. Completing the required 25 missions felt like a near impossibility. As one gunner put it, the only way you finished your tour was if you were shot down and captured. Despite the losses, Washington pressed the offensive. The 8th Air Force was America's spearhead in Europe, and political leaders demanded results. Newspapers back home spoke of heroism and progress, but the truth was grim. The 8th was bleeding, and the Luftwaffe remained strong. German fighters still dominated the skies over Europe, and each new mission felt like flying into a meat grinder. The strain showed in the men themselves. Crews returned from missions with 1,000-yard stares, their nerves frayed by the constant sight of death. Some broke down under the pressure, what was then called flak happy, but is now recognized as combat stress. Others dealt with fear through dark humor, painting names like Murder, Inc., or Susie Q on their planes. Yet even in the face of mounting losses, the 8th kept flying. Back in the United States, the image of the mighty 8th grew larger than life. Hollywood films like Air Force and newsreels celebrated the bomber crews as heroes. Recruiting posters proclaimed, "Join the Air Corps, be one of the few." Families back home clipped newspaper articles, proud of their sons, even as they feared the telegram that might arrive at any moment. For the Luftwaffe, 1943 was still a year of dominance. They had inflicted massive losses on the Americans and believed they could continue to bleed the 8th into irrelevance. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Every battle cost the Luftwaffe irreplaceable pilots, while American production lines in Detroit and Seattle churned out more planes and trained more crews. The question was whether the 8th could endure long enough for those reinforcements to make the difference. By late 1943, the stakes were higher than ever. The combined bomber offensive demanded that the 8th take the fight deeper into Germany, to the very heart of its industrial base. But without long-range fighter escort, the Americans were dangerously exposed. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission proved that precision bombing alone could not win the air war. The gamble of daylight bombing was reaching a breaking point. Unless something changed, the 8th Air Force risked being destroyed in the skies over Europe. The solution, though not yet fully realized, was already waiting in the wings. A sleek, long-range fighter that would change everything. By late 1943, the 8th Air Force had proven two things beyond doubt. Its bomber crews were courageous, and its doctrine of unescorted daylight bombing was unsustainable. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg disaster had made that painfully clear. American bombers could deliver punishing blows, but without long-range fighter protection, they were lambs in a den of wolves. The Luftwaffe exploited this weakness mercilessly. The geography of the war magnified the danger. From their bases in East Anglia, bombers had to fly hundreds of miles across occupied Europe to strike Germany's industrial heartland. Fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the British Spitfire could provide escort only for part of the journey. Once the bombers passed beyond the range of Allied fighters, usually somewhere near the Rhine, they entered what aircrews grimly called the Black Hole. It was in this zone, stretching across central Germany, that the Luftwaffe struck hardest. German tactics were brutally effective. Controllers on the ground guided waves of Bf-109s and Fw-190s toward the formations. Some fighters attacked head-on, firing cannons into the noses of the bombers where armor was weakest. Others used coordinated slashing attacks, diving through the bomber boxes and spraying gunfire before peeling away. Even more devastating were the Sturmgruppen Units F-W-190s, heavily armed and armored, designed to rip apart bomber formations at close range. These pilots often pressed home their attacks until collisions seemed inevitable. The bombers fought back with everything they had. Gunners in nose, tail, waist and top turrets poured streams of .50 caliber fire into the sky, sometimes claiming dozens of kills in a single mission. Crews stuck together in disciplined combat boxes, knowing that a straggler was easy prey, but even the toughest flying fortress could not withstand endless assaults. Each mission ended with fields across Germany littered with wreckage, parachutes drifting to earth, and columns of smoke marking where aircraft had gone down. For the men of the 8th, the fighter problem was not an abstraction. It was a daily nightmare. They could hear the chatter of German radios, see the enemy fighters forming up on the horizon, and watch them dive in with lethal precision. Casualty rates skyrocketed. In some bomb groups, entire squadrons were wiped out in a matter of weeks. The official requirement for completing a combat tour was 25 missions, but the odds of making it that far were grim. One crewman remarked bitterly, "There are only two ways out of here, through a wooden box or a German prison camp." The psychological strain was immense. Crews watched friends vanish in fireballs or parachute into captivity, mission after mission. Some men cracked under the pressure, feigning illness or begging for reassignment. Others steeled themselves with fatalism, telling each other, "If it's your time, it's your time." Chaplains worked overtime, offering comfort before dawn takeoffs, while ground crews painted ever more defiant nose art on the bombers. Angry pin-ups, snarling animals, and slogans like "fighting spirit" or "heavenly body." High command in Washington and London knew something had to change. Precision bombing was the cornerstone of the Allied strategy, but without a solution to the fighter problem, the 8th Air Force risked annihilation. The search for an answer took many forms. Engineers worked to fit drop tanks to existing fighters, extending their range. Tactical commanders experimented with different escort techniques, trying to find the balance between staying close to the bombers and roaming ahead to break up German attacks. But the truth was that the P-47 Thunderbolt, despite its ruggedness, simply lacked the range to stay with the bombers deep into Germany. The British Spitfire was even shorter, legged. What the Americans needed was a fighter that could fly all the way to Berlin and back, fight toe-to-toe with the Luftwaffe, and still escort the bombers home. Until that fighter arrived, the 8th would continue to bleed. In the autumn of 1943, the crisis reached its peak. Losses in October were so severe that some leaders questioned whether the daylight bombing campaign could continue at all. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14th became infamous as Black Thursday. 60 bombers were lost and nearly 600 men killed or captured. Survivors staggered back to their bases in shattered aircraft, some with only one engine running, others missing entire sections of fuselage. It was the bloodiest day in the history of the 8th Air Force. The Luftwaffe seemed invincible. German propaganda trumpeted the failures of the daylight offensive, and even some Allied leaders wondered if the Americans had been too stubborn in clinging to their precision doctrine. But just as the crisis reached its worst point, salvation was arriving, sleek, fast, and with the range to finally turn the tables on the Luftwaffe. As the 8th Air Force reeled from staggering losses in 1943, the solution to its greatest problem, the lack of a true long-range escort fighter, was already waiting in the wings. The aircraft that would change the air war over Europe was sleek, fast, and deadly. Its name would become legendary, the North American P-51 Mustang. Ironically, the Mustang began as a British request. In 1940, before America had even entered the war, the RAF asked North American Aviation to design a fighter for them. The result was a promising but underpowered plane. Its true potential emerged only after British engineers fitted it with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same powerplant that drove the Spitfire. The transformation was dramatic. Suddenly, the Mustang could climb higher, fly faster, and most importantly, travel farther than any Allied fighter before it. By late 1943, Mustangs equipped with drop tanks were capable of flying from England to Berlin and back, a round trip of nearly 100 miles. For the first time, the 8th Air Force had a fighter that could stick with the bombers all the way to their targets deep in Germany. And the Mustang wasn't just long-legged, it was lethal. Armed with 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, it could shred a Luftwaffe fighter in seconds. Its agility rivaled the German Bf 109 and Fw 190, giving American pilots the confidence to take the fight directly to the enemy. The arrival of the P-51 coincided with a shift in escort tactics under the leadership of General Jimmy Doolittle, who took command of the 8th in early 1944. Until then, escorts were ordered to fly tight with the bombers, forming a defensive shield. Doolittle tore up the rulebook. He instructed Mustang pilots to range ahead, hunting the Luftwaffe wherever they found it. The goal was not just to protect the bombers, but to destroy the German fighter force itself. The bombers are the bait, Doolittle told his men. With the P-51, the 8th now had the teeth to back up that strategy. The change was immediate and dramatic. On missions over Frankfurt, Leipzig, and Berlin, swarms of Mustangs tangled with the Luftwaffe before they could reach the bomber streams. Dogfights erupted across the skies, contrails crisscrossing like white scars against the blue. American pilots, many of them barely out of flight school, suddenly had the upper hand. The Mustang's speed and endurance allowed them to chase German fighters back to their bases, and even strafe airfields on the way home. The Luftwaffe, once feared as an unstoppable predator, now found itself hunted. For bomber crews, the sight of Mustangs overhead was salvation. Survivors spoke of the lift in morale when they saw the long, elegant silhouettes of P-51 sliding into formation beside them as they crossed into Germany. It was like having guardian angels, one B-17 pilot recalled. We knew then we had a fighting chance to get home. Losses dropped, confidence returned, and the daylight bombing campaign, once teetering on collapse, roared back with new momentum. The Mustang also gave American pilots a chance to rack up impressive kill counts. Aces like George Preddy, Bud Anderson, and John C. Mayer became household names, celebrated in newsreels and magazines back home. Their stories of daring dogfights captured the imagination of the American public, fueling support for the air campaign. But behind the glamour was a grim reality. Air combat was still deadly, and many Mustang pilots never made it back. The difference was that, at last, the balance of attrition favored the Allies, not the Germans. By early 1944, the P-51 was flying in ever greater numbers, complementing the still formidable P-47 Thunderbolt and Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Together, these fighters extended the shield over the bombers, but it was the Mustang that symbolized the turning tide. The Luftwaffe could no longer mass its fighters against unprotected formations without suffering catastrophic losses of its own. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound. Once accustomed to attacking helpless bomber streams, they now faced swarms of aggressive, long-range escorts. The attrition of experienced Luftwaffe aces accelerated, while Germany struggled to train replacements fast enough. Meanwhile, American industry churned out Mustangs in staggering numbers, ensuring that the skies grew ever more crowded with the silver-winged fighters. By the spring of 1944, the 8th Air Force was poised to deliver its most decisive blow yet. The bombers had their escorts, the fighters had their orders, and the Luftwaffe was about to be dragged into a battle it could not afford to lose. The showdown would come in a campaign known as Big Week. By early 1944, the stage was set for a showdown in the skies over Europe. The 8th Air Force, now armed with the P-51 Mustang, was ready to press its advantage. The Allied High Command knew that before the planned invasion of France could succeed, one obstacle had to be removed, the Luftwaffe. Germany's fighter force had to be broken, and its aircraft industry crippled. The operation to achieve that goal became one of the most decisive campaigns of the air war operation argument, better known as Big Week. Running from February 20 to 25, 1944, Big Week was a coordinated assault by the 8th Air Force, the RAF, and the 15th Air Force operating out of Italy. The targets were Germany's aircraft factories, repair facilities, and component plant. Everything from Messerschmitt assembly lines to ball bearing production. For the Allies, it was a calculated gamble. Send massive bomber streams deep into enemy territory, bait the Luftwaffe into battle, and use long-range escorts to grind down Germany's fighter force once and for all. The scale was unprecedented. Each day, hundreds of bombers roared off the runways of East Anglia, their engines shaking the English countryside as villagers watched from hedgerows and churchyards. Above them circled P-51s, P-47s, and P-38s, ready to meet the enemy head-on. Once across the channel, contrails filled the skies like ghostly highways, marking the paths of the bomber streams as they pushed toward targets like Leipzig, Augsburg, and Regensburg. The Luftwaffe responded with everything it had. Squadrons of Bf-109s and FW-190 scrambled to meet the Americans, diving through flak bursts to tear into the formations. But this time, things were different. The Mustangs pounced, engaging German fighters long before they reached the bombers. Dogfights erupted across the sky, twisting and turning duels that stretched for miles. American pilots chased their opponents relentlessly, sometimes following them all the way back to their airfields and strafing the runways as they landed. Losses were heavy on both sides. The 8th lost hundreds of bombers and fighters during the week, with thousands of airmen killed, wounded, or captured. Yet the Luftwaffe's losses were far worse. Germany could not replace its experienced fighter pilots, many of whom had been flying since the early days of the war. Each ace lost was irreplaceable, while American training schools back home were producing new pilots in overwhelming numbers. For the bomber crews, Big Week was a trial by fire. Missions stretched for hours with endless attacks by fighters and waves of flak. Men watched their friends disintegrate in fireballs or bail out into captivity. But they pressed on, driven by duty and by the knowledge that each mission brought the Allies closer to victory. As one B-17 gunner wrote in his diary, the sky was alive with death. But we knew if we could get through this week, maybe we could win the air. The results were decisive. German aircraft production was badly disrupted, with factories bombed, assembly lines halted, and components scattered across smouldering ruins. Even more importantly, the Luftwaffe had been forced into a battle of attrition it could not sustain. In a single week, thousands of German fighters were destroyed and hundreds of veteran pilots were lost. The once dominant Luftwaffe emerged from Big Week a shadow of its former self. The psychological effect was just as important. For the first time, American crews felt that the balance had tipped. They were no longer helpless targets. They were part of a machine that could not only survive but dominate. Reports from the German side told the same story. Pilots complained of endless swarms of Mustangs, of exhaustion, and of a sense that the skies were slipping away. Big Week did not end the Luftwaffe, but it marked the beginning of the end. From that point forward, the Germans were on the defensive, struggling to replace losses, while their skies filled with Allied bombers and fighters. For the 8th Air Force, the campaign proved that daylight bombing, once dismissed as suicidal, could succeed when paired with proper escort and overwhelming force. When the smoke cleared in late February, the Allies had achieved air superiority in principle, if not yet in total practice. And with the invasion of Normandy only months away, that superiority would soon prove decisive. By the spring of 1944, the mighty 8th had turned the tide. Big Week had gutted the Luftwaffe, and the arrival of the P-51 Mustang ensured that American bombers could now reach the heart of Germany with powerful escort. But the strategic bombing campaign had a larger purpose: to prepare the way for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy. The success of D-Day would depend not only on soldiers storming the beaches, but also on the skies above them being free of German fighters. In the weeks leading up to June 6th, the 8th Air Force waged a relentless campaign of preparation. The strategy was clear: cripple the German transportation network, isolate the battlefield, and prevent reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Bombers pounded rail yards, bridges, and highways across northern France. Cities like Caen, Rouen, and Saint-Lô became targets not because of their industry, but because of their role as transportation hubs. The goal was not destruction for its own sake, but to choke the movement of German troops and armor. For the crews, these missions were a grim reminder of the war's human cost. Accuracy was improving, but even with the Norden bombsight, striking rail lines from 0 feet often meant civilian casualties. French villages and towns bore the brunt, and airmen later spoke of the guilt they carried. But the larger mission was clear: without air supremacy, the invasion could fail and the war could drag on for years. On D-Day itself, June 6, 1944, the 8th Air Force played a vital role. Before dawn, waves of bombers and fighters swept across the Channel, hammering coastal defenses, gun emplacements, and strongpoints behind the beaches. P-51s, P-47s, and P-38s roamed the skies above Normandy, strafing German columns and tangling with the few Luftwaffe fighters that dared to rise. The result was decisive. The German Air Force was virtually absent from the invasion. Allied soldiers stormed the beaches under skies owned by the Allies. The weeks that followed cemented that dominance. As the ground battle raged through the hedgerows of Normandy, the 8th Air Force and its British counterparts flew mission after mission to disrupt German logistics. Bridges over the Seine, supply depots, and fuel dumps went up in flames. Luftwaffe airfields were bombed repeatedly, denying the Germans the chance to rebuild their fighter force. By late summer, the Allies had achieved something unthinkable just a year earlier: complete control of the skies over France. For the Germans, the consequences were catastrophic. Their fighter force, already weakened from Big Week, was now unable to mount a serious challenge. Even when new aircraft like the Me-262 jet fighter appeared, they were too few in number, too late, and too vulnerable to Allied attacks on the ground. German divisions retreating from Normandy were harried constantly by Allied aircraft. Veterans recalled that any movement in daylight, whether a convoy of trucks or a single tank, was almost certain to draw a swarm of American or British fighters. For the 8th Air Force, D-Day and the subsequent campaign in France marked a turning point. No longer were they merely fighting for survival in the skies. Now they were shaping the outcome of the war on the ground. Their efforts had made the invasion possible and had ensured that Allied troops could advance without fear of German air attack. The achievement did not come without cost. Losses were still high, and missions were grueling. Crews flew in bad weather, through thick flak, and against pockets of determined German resistance. Many paid with their lives, even in the final months of the war. But unlike in 1943, the balance had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. For the first time, victory felt inevitable. By the fall of 1944, the 8th Air Force was flying missions not just in support of ground operations, but deep into Germany once more. The Luftwaffe was broken, but the war was not yet won. Ahead lay the bombing of Berlin, the destruction of oil refineries, and the final hammer blows that would bring Nazi Germany to its knees. By late 1944, the 8th Air Force had achieved what once seemed impossible. It had broken the Luftwaffe. German fighter units were a shadow of their former selves. their ranks depleted of veteran pilots, their aircraft production crippled by relentless bombing, and their morale battered by the unending presence of Allied air power. Yet the war was not over, and the mighty Eighth was about to deliver the final hammer blows that would leave Germany unable to resist. The campaign shifted focus to Germany's oil industry. Fuel was the lifeblood of the Nazi war machine, and by 1944, synthetic oil plants at Luna, Pollitz, and Merseburg were prime targets. Without fuel, tanks could not roll, planes could not fly, and trucks could not supply the front lines. Day after day, streams of B-17s and B-24s droned eastward, escorted by swarms of P-51s, pounding refineries until black smoke blotted out the sky. German commanders later admitted that the oil campaign was decisive. Fighter training hours plummeted, panzer divisions stalled, and even the mighty Me-2, 162 jet fighter, Germany's last hope for air superiority, was crippled by lack of fuel. The bombing of Berlin became another symbol of Allied dominance. Once Hitler's proud capital, Berlin was now within the grasp of American bombers. Raids in late 1944 and early 1945 reduced rail yards, factories, and government buildings to rubble. Though the Luftwaffe tried to resist, the effort was feeble. Where once hundreds of German fighters rose to challenge the Eighth, now only a few scattered units appeared, and they were quickly swept aside by the Mustangs. American crews who had once dreaded missions deep into Germany now spoke with grim confidence. "We owned the skies," one recalled. "Still, the fighting remained deadly. Flak was as dangerous as ever, black bursts tearing into bomber formations, and even with the Luftwaffe weakened, new threats emerged. The German jet, the Messerschmitt Me-2 162, could outfly any Allied fighter. When it appeared in combat late in 1944, it shocked American crews, but its impact was limited. Allied bombing of fuel supplies and airfields kept numbers low, while P-51 pilots developed tactics to catch the jets during takeoff and landing. Brave though the German jet pilots were, the Me-2 162 arrived too late to change the war's outcome. On the ground, the collapse of German air power had dramatic consequences. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, the Luftwaffe attempted one last major offensive, launching surprise attacks against Allied airfields and supporting German ground forces. But the effort quickly fizzled. Once the weather cleared, the 8th Air Force and its escorts unleashed devastation on German supply lines, armor, and troop concentrations. Veterans recalled that German soldiers dreaded Allied aircraft more than anything else. As one American infantryman put it, if you could hear the roar of Mustangs overhead, you knew you were safe. The final months of the war were a relentless aerial onslaught. From January to April 1945, the 8th Air Force launched massive raids against what remained of Germany's industrial base, rail network, and cities. Dresden, already bombed by the RAF at night, was struck by American bombers by day. Oil facilities that had somehow survived earlier raids were obliterated. Rail lines that tried to feed the front collapsed under the weight of craters. By the time Soviet troops closed in from the east, Germany was not just beaten on the battlefield, it was starved of the means to fight. For the men of the 8th, the final missions carried a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that the end was near, sorrow for the friends who had not lived to see it. Some crews completed their 25 missions and returned home, greeted as heroes in the United States. Others, newly arrived, flew their first and only missions in the dying weeks of the war. Losses continued until the very last days, as flak and the occasional desperate German fighter still claimed lives. But the outcome was beyond doubt. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe was effectively finished. Its airfields were bombed, out craters, its factories in ruins, its pilots either dead, captured, or grounded for lack of fuel. The 8th Air Force had delivered on its promise. It had crushed the Luftwaffe and secured Allied control of the skies. This victory paved the way for the final Allied advance into Germany, ensuring that no counterattack could succeed and no hope of prolonging the war remained. For the United States, the campaign was more than a victory in Europe. It was proof of concept that air power wielded strategically and decisively could determine the outcome of modern war. And for the men who flew and fought in the skies over Europe, it was a legacy etched in sacrifice, courage, and the contrails of 1,000 missions. May 1945, the guns fell silent in Europe, and the war that had consumed the continent for nearly 6 years was finally over. For the 8th Air Force, victory carried both pride and pain. They had helped crush the Luftwaffe, won control of the skies, and paved the way for D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, and the final Allied advance into Germany. Yet the cost was staggering. More than 26,000 airmen of the 8th never came home. Cemeteries across England, France, and the United States bore silent witness to the price of air supremacy. The legacy of the 8th Air Force was both immediate and enduring. In the short term, it demonstrated beyond doubt that air power could shape the outcome of a modern war. By destroying Germany's ability to contest the skies, the 8th gave the Allies freedom of movement on the ground and in the air. Tanks could advance, supply lines could flow, and invasions could succeed because the Luftwaffe had been broken. No German counterattack could succeed without air cover, and no factory could produce war material without fuel. The 8th's relentless bombing campaign made sure of it, but the longer-term impact went far beyond 1945. The 8th Air Force proved the doctrine of strategic bombing on a scale never before attempted. It showed that precision bombing, though often imperfect, could cripple an enemy's industry when combined with massed firepower and fighter escort. It validated the belief that control of the skies was not just a supporting role, but a decisive factor in victory. In many ways, the war in Europe became the blueprint for American air power in the decades to come. The post-war U.S. Air Force, established as a separate branch in 1947, owed much of its identity to the experience of the mighty 8th. Lessons learned in the skies over Germany shaped everything from aircraft design to tactics and strategy. Long-range bombers, jet fighters, nuclear deterrence, and later precision-guided munitions all trace their lineage back to the ideas tested in the crucible of World War II. For the men who served, the legacy was personal. Survivors returned home to ticker, tape parades, GI Bill benefits, and the embrace of families who had prayed for their safe return. Many became part of what would later be called the Greatest Generation, building businesses, raising families, and contributing to a post-war America that was stronger than ever. Yet they never forgot the faces of the comrades who didn't make it back. Reunion groups, memoirs, and museums kept their stories alive, ensuring that the courage of bomber crews and fighter pilots would not be lost to history. In Britain, the presence of the 8th left its own mark. The airfields of East Anglia, once filled with the roar of B-17s and the laughter of American airmen in village pubs, gradually returned to farmland. But memorials, museums, and airshows still draw visitors who remember the days when England was the launching pad for the greatest air armada in history. The bond between British villagers and the Yanks, who lived among them, became part of the shared memory of the war. Historians continue to debate the morality and effectiveness of strategic bombing. Civilian casualties were high, and entire cities were reduced to rubble. Yet few dispute that without the destruction of the Luftwaffe, the Allied invasion of Europe would have been far more costly, perhaps even impossible. The 8th Air Force may not have won the war alone, but it ensured that the Allies could win it at all. For Americans today, the story of the mighty 8th resonates as a testament to determination, sacrifice, and innovation. It is the story of young men, many barely in their 20s, who climbed into bombers and fighters knowing the odds were against them, yet flew anyway. It is the story of a nation that harnessed its industrial might, its ingenuity, and its will to fight, and projected that power across an ocean to liberate a continent. In the end, the 8th Air Force did more than crush the Luftwaffe. It established the United States as the world's preeminent air power, a status it holds to this day. Its legacy lives on in every American airman who takes to the skies, in every aircraft that bears the insignia of the U.S. Air Force, and in every free nation that remembers what was achieved when the mighty 8th rose into the skies over Europe.